Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle US Paratroopers, but for those who were slightly earlier war, at least as far as America's involvement was concerned. I've already done late war Paratroopers in the more green shade on the channel, but I figured it was finally time to go ahead and grab one of the guys who would have jumped on Sicily or Normandy for that sort of early, invasion stage of the war. So this is one of the metal figures available from Warlord Games. I will link to that specific box in the description below so that you can, go check it out yourself. All of the paints will be listed in the description along with the numbers for the VALLEJO colors, which I'm going to use today. Let's get started. As you can see, I've started this fella off with a primer spray of Skeleton Bone from the Army Painter. If you want a slightly more muted finish, you might go for something like Khaki from VALLEJO. But I like to think that this is going to give us a slightly brighter finish overall, and it's going to work better for some of the colors that we'll be using. I'm going to start off here. I have a German Camo Beige. This is a VALLEJO color. And I'm going to apply this with just a little bit of water in there. And I've got a brush with a bit of a wedge tip. This is the Citadel large base brush. But anything like this will do the job. As you can see, I'm not too fussed if I hit his webbing or his skin or anything. What I'm going to do is just cruise around the whole miniature and make sure that his uniform is in this color. Now you might notice that this is, doesn't look quite as yellow or as green as it does on Band of Brothers, but that's because those sort of period style films undergo a process called bleach bypass. And what that gives you is a finish which is a little more yellow, slightly washed out, and it affects greens as well. So if you want to sort of recreate that screen finish, you want the Band of Brothers look, try mixing in just a little dot of Middlestone to your German Camo Beige when you apply it, and you'll get that finish. But I'm going to go with slightly more realistic here. Now that will need a second coat in order to solidify the color, but then you'll end up with something that looks like this. What I'm going to move on to here is this doubler on his shoulder. Now this thing here, this was a gas detection brassard, and they were British made, and the idea is it was a sheet of impregnated paper that would change color if it came into contact with poisonous gas. They would turn red or pink, and because the idea was Allied High Command was not sure at this stage exactly how desperate the German defenders would be, and would they deploy gas. Now there were two different colors to these. There was a sort of pale green one and a yellowy sort of one. And honestly, trying to find the answer to which color was worn is a little difficult. All of the sources I could find discussing these brassards suggested that both colors were worn essentially interchangeably. These were for invasion purposes. So I'm using here, this is just desert yellow, and I'm going to give this a quick pass. And once that's a solid color, we'll be quite happy with that, to be honest. So after a couple of coats of desert yellow, we're going to move on and start painting his skin. Now for this, I'm going to use Army Painter's Barbarian Flesh. Any sort of skin tone, everybody likes painting their faces slightly differently. But I'm going to give this fella a couple of coats of this on his face and hands. Now some of these miniatures you'll find they're wearing the jump gloves. In which case I would start those off with a coat of Iraqi Sand, but this fella, I don't have to worry about that. When it comes to straps and what have you on his helmet, just paint over them. It's not really going to matter too much. Now we'll move on and paint his pack and his webbing, and for this I'm going to use Pastel Green. Now if you've never seen me use this before, this is an absolutely awful color when it goes on, but once we've shaded it, it is going to look very much like faded khaki. Now your paratroopers going in with the newest equipment would very likely have been wearing this sort of lighter green rather than the yellowish the yellowish webbing that you would sometimes see. You might want to double check that statement if you're doing these paratroopers for the Italian invasion. Now, before I was rudely interrupted by my phone running out of storage space, I was about to mention that I've seen a bunch of different helmet strap configurations for these helmets. Most of them do feature a cloth or canvas chin strap. So I'm going to paint that in with the same pastel green as the rest of the webbing. Remember too that he's got this little boot strap where he's got his combat knife there strapped to his leg. So don't forget that. We're probably going to make a mess of that later when we paint his boots, but don't worry. Now speaking of his helmet, I've got here Camo Olive Dark Green. And what I'm going to do is use one of my little flat-edged brushes so that I can quite generously sort of stab this in, because you'll find on these metal miniatures, you want to be a little more generous in how you sort of get into all these little pits and recesses in the camo on his helmet. Now don't worry if you're sort of painting over any of the scrim and the netting, because we're going to fix that up a little bit later. And just while I'm doing this, you'll see here he's got this entrenching tool on his leg too. And I'm painting that green. Sometimes these would have been exposed wood. Sometimes they were extremely dark, sort of almost black, handled. But sometimes they were also sprayed in this sort of olive green color too. So if he's got a new one, chances are good it's probably green. But whatever the case, I'm going to finish off his helmet and then swap on down to a smaller brush to finish off his entrenching tool handle. Now speaking of dark green, I have a color here literally called US Dark Green. And we're going to use this to paint in the little patches that are reinforced on his knees and elbows. Now we're going to move on to those famous Corcoran jump boots and any other leather details. And for this I'm going to use my favorite leather color, Mahogany Brown. You'll see this gives us a nice warm red leather. And this fella here, for example, with his boot strap, I'm just going to paint as carefully as I can. A little bit of splattering there on that ankle strap. Not to worry, we will fix that up in a bit. Now we're starting to look like a paratrooper. I've got some black, and what I'm going to do is blacken sort of the metal parts of his weaponry. So just along the top of his Thompson here. And I'm going to get in, probably with a smaller brush, and do the cap on his water bottle there too. And don't forget if he's wearing an ankle knife. And then I've got a little bit of beige brown for the wooden details. Now I generally find it easier to paint the wood, like a Garand or an M1 carbine first and then do the black. Whereas with Thompsons it's the reverse. So up to you what order you do this in, but beige brown for your wood, nice and simple. Now for his helmet netting, what I've got is my little stabby brush from earlier, and we're just going to dry brush lightly some khaki over the top of the netting. We could probably be a little more generous than that, but over the netting and any of the little scrim that he's added to that. This isn't a final stage, of course, but it does sort of prep the helmet for stage 2, which comes a little later on. Now after this, what I'm going to do is go back and tidy up any little moments where I've gone overboard. So for example, I'm going to tidy up that strap on his boot, any little bits of his uniform where I might have hit them with the wrong color. Save your tidy up till last, because you'll find it saves you time overall. So once you've done all of your last bits of tidy up, let's go ahead, shake up your strong tone. And I'm going to use a mix of this of 1, 2, 3 drops of strong tone. To my usual 1 and 2 of the Quickshade mixing medium. Now I use this because I don't want the strong tone to really stain the finish. I just want it to get into the recesses and give me all that shading. So I've got my wash brush here. Let's mix this together. And once you've got your shade mixed in nice and cloudy, let's go ahead and start applying it to the whole miniature. You'll notice this goes on quite gloopy. So while it's still wet, you can use your brush to sort of guide that around, get it into any recesses where you need it to be. And any big flat areas, like say I get a big blodge on his entrenching tool there, just guide that away. And let's finish this whole miniature. Give it about 30 minutes to dry. Now I think there's one or two recesses here which are still a little bit wet, but for our purposes, that's absolutely fine. You'll see we've got lots of nice deep shading, and from here you could honestly just varnish them up and put them on the table. But what I'm going to do is carry on here, and we're going to start with highlighting his jacket. Now there are a few ways you can do this, and the choice is yours. Either you can start by going straight back to the base color, so this would be German Camo Beige, and start by just painting over flat areas to bulk out that original color. Now if you were painting a display piece, this is a really good way because people are going to pick it up and take a close look. Personally though, I think for gaming figures you want a nice high contrast highlight so that it's easier to see the shape of the miniature from table distance. So what we're going to do is to grab ourselves a little fresh amount of German Camo Beige and then a tiny wee dot of Ivory. Now Ivory is great if you're mixing anything for clothing, because this will give you sort of a natural faded look to whatever you're doing. It's not great if you're doing, say, hard edge stuff ordinarily, but for fabric, just mixing that in until you get a look at, that should work pretty well. Now let's get our Ivory Camo mix here, and we'll apply a little line to the back of his tunic. And you can see straight away, there's a nice sharp highlight there. So on his pockets, on his trousers, anywhere that you want a really nice sharp edge, just to help define some of the shape of the miniature from afar. Your Ivory German Camo Beige mix is going to help you with that. Now if you don't want to mix a highlight, you can go to Warlord Games and get Khaki Webbing. This is actually an army painter paint, which is part of their rapid deployment system. And it's very similar to our mix that we just did. You'll see, if I go on his pockets and the edges of his tunic, it's a little difficult to tell the difference on camera. But this is not quite as bright as it would look compared to the to our mix. So me being me, because I quite like being able to skip mixing wherever possible. So I'm going to use this khaki webbing to sort of demonstrate what that would look like. But you can of course use whatever's available to you. So just thought it would be worth showing two different methods there. Now sometimes that can be a little difficult to see while you're doing it because of the shine of the shade, but when we go ahead and we do hit this with a matte varnish, that's going to be much more prominent. What I've got here, now there are two green greys in the VALLEJO stable, and I'm using the much brighter one, and we're just going to edge in some of the webbing here. Now you'll probably want to be quite sparing with this, but this is red leather, and we're going to go ahead and just pop in a couple of little lines on a red leather. Anywhere that you go overboard with this, what you can do is go back to your Mahogany Brown and straighten that out if you need to. Now I mentioned using Iraqi Sand if your miniature had gloves, but it also works very well as a nice quick highlight for desert yellow. If you do need to highlight gloves, then over the top of Iraqi Sand, once it's been shaded, a little bit of buff, which is it's a really light beige, and it works extremely well as a highlight for that. Now whether you've got German Camo Beige or I'm actually using the Beige Ivory mix, what I'm going to do is just pick out the sort of scrim that he's got in his helmet netting here. Now for his skin, I'm actually going to go back to Barbarian Flesh. Like I've mentioned, painting skin is totally up to you, but I'm going to use this to almost cover all of the skin back over again. I want to make this a little bit warmer. Now I've got a little bit of VALLEJO's basic skin tone. And honestly, if you see anybody who's this color, you probably want to call an ambulance. This is extremely bright. But what we're going to do is just paint in the backs of his knuckles and areas on his face like nose, cheekbones, very carefully. And let's come back in a second here. Then I've got just a little bit of flesh wash. This is an army painter one I'm using, but any one that you like the look of will work perfectly well here. You don't want to go too heavy with it. This is just to reintroduce a little bit of warmth to that skin tone. Now while that's drying, I've got here a little oily steel from VALLEJO. And we're just going to put on tiny little, just about lost it there, tiny little lines of this on the extreme edges of his Thompson. Now once you finish those last couple of details, I've gone ahead and I've hit him with a varnish spray of VALLEJO's matte varnish. You'll see it brings together those highlights, sort of subtles? It makes everything a little more subtle. I gotta figure out, you see there'd be a word for that in German. Now if you're looking for a brush-on recommendation, I'd go with Instar's Varnish Plus. This stuff is wonderfully matte. It looks pretty much identical to this. I spray my varnishes because, the weather's generally pretty good here, but if you prefer a little bit more control or you just can't spray for whatever reason, this would be my go-to. What I'm going to do now, though, is go ahead and finish off his base, and we'll get a look at what he looks like once he's all in context. And there we have it, our paratrooper is complete. Now, his skin tone is a little darker and perhaps a bit more red than I ordinarily would paint him, but because I'm planning on this guy being able to pull double duty for the Sicilian campaign, when I want to do the invasion of Italy, that's why I figure a slightly more sort of sun-touched skin tone will work pretty well, and once he's on the table alongside all of his mates in Normandy, you'll never tell the difference. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the lovely patrons who are keeping me ticking over in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Connor, Trainboy, and Fred. Your support is invaluable, folks. So any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Facebook are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.